You are listening to Something Rather Than Nothing. Creator and host, Ken Vellante. Editor and producer, Peter Bauer.
Hey everybody, this is Ken Vellante with the Something Rather Than Nothing podcast, and I'm very excited to have Ben Tanzer on the show. My gosh, Ben, reading and looking and listening to your podcast, see all the different things that you've done and do, really exciting. But today, you've got a new book out, The Missing. So I figured we would start there. And could you tell us about The Missing, the immediate event and your relationship to it and creating that book?
Yeah, right on. So first, Ken, just thank you for doing this. And I got to say, by the way, people love to make that joke, I have a face for radio or a podcast, but the real thing is who's got the actual voice for it. So, dude, I got to say, one of your great, awesome strengths on this show is your voice is amazing. I hope you're doing voiceover work somewhere, or I'm going to start pitching you because, man, you should be all over the place with that voice.
Thank you, brother.
I love it. I will say, years ago, I had to interview a guy for a project, and he was a radio personality. And it was the first time, like a real, legit big deal guy back when that was a big deal. He was on the board of a nonprofit, and that's why I met him. But we sat down with him in a bar, and he started talking, and I was mesmerized. Like, you hear it on a radio and you're like, is that person like that in real life? Then he comes in, he's like, well, hello. I thought, that's genetics and shit. That's amazing. So anyway, The Missing. Yeah, thanks so much. This is a novel. It is, I don't know if this is important, but it's my first book in a number of years. So it's kind of weird and interesting talking about it. And it's my first novel in, speaking of my relationship to it, I believe since 2013. So it's a weird, awesome, space to be back in. I mean, this book was built around this idea that what would it look like if your kid ran away? You were a married couple. And so this right off the first page. What if your kid ran away and didn't want to be found? Like, that part's really important. It's not criminal. It may not even be personal, though, of course, it's personal, but your kid's just like, I'm not going to be in touch. You're not going to find me, even in the age of social media. And so what does that look like for the couple who maybe in some ways their marriage has been particularly held together because their kid's in the middle of it and they can set aside their own past, their own fears, their own bad urges. And so I thought that would be really interesting. And it was funny because someone said something the other night, I think we were just talking about the book. And they said, oh, so you don't really focus on the kid at all, which isn't entirely true, except it is true that I thought the kid's a ghost, right? No, yeah. This is really about, it's not a kid's book. It's not for kids. So of course, we welcome everybody reading and buying it. But I did really want to think, what does it look like to be in a long-time relationship and think, oh, we got to do this now? I would add, just because you're asking about my relationship to it, I wrote it a while ago. Like, it ended up gestating in weird ways that were not intended. But at the time I wrote it, I had two much younger children. I mean, they were not little kids, but now they're adults or nearly adults. And several people refer to the book as an empty nest book. And I'm fascinated by that because I have been looking forward to an empty nest with all respect to my lovely boys. But to me, empty nest is something positive, or could be. It's something you build towards and build on. And I'm thinking, wow, if your kid just snatched away from you, it is technically an empty nest, but there's nothing good about it. And so I really wanted to play with that idea, right? Like, what if there's nothing good about it? I mean, of course, there's nothing really good about it. And what would that look like over time, especially when you're just not going to find anything out? So that's my relationship to it. The one thing I'll add, just because it's come up since you and I even first connected, is that I don't have a true relationship to this theme. It really is fiction, except I understand fear, and parenting and being so worried about dumb shit and trying to be a good partner. So that's what I channeled. Since the book started getting some traction, not one, but two people have said to me, oh, yeah, no, I have a friend where that happened. And that is wild to me. So they know someone personally where their teenager ran away and they never spoke to them again. I know it's not fantasy because I had been influenced by an interview I'd heard years ago where somebody was talking about that. And I could never get it out of my head. But now I'm meeting people where they're like, yeah, that's more normal than you think, which is just weird. So that's my other relationship to it. really not knowing what I'm talking about, except for the fear, anger, compulsion part, which I know a lot about. And then meeting people who are like, yeah, wow, this is my friend's experience. So I'm thinking, oh, that makes me very sad, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, just right off the bat and the premise, I could say, having children myself, in just seeing for me, the biggest shock in the development of my relationship was, as they got older, because like there's some sort of idea in my head or maybe others' head. It's like, oh, the kids are getting older and everything's easy or something, or like you took care of them and now they're on their way. But is certainly not that. It's certainly a lot more where what my kids were going through as they got older, reflecting on my own experience and maybe a deeper connection to that, which was, unsettling a bit. So it wasn't like, hey, tag out, and the
Right.
dynamics that you mentioned of, in this case, tragically, where, a child isn't there because, because disappearance and missing. But I think you're right, whether folks are connecting to that aspect of it, which is, that difficult part of it, or the fact of, heck, what happens to this relationship? Because a lot of people can really connect to the shocking dynamic change of when it's like, you and your partner, and it's you too, and so I could see a lot of folks generally, really connecting to that. So very excited to hear the book out today, everybody. The Missing. We'll chat some more about it, Ben.
Great.
But what you've written before? I mean, take a look at your website. I've seen some of your creations, your podcast. You do a lot of different things, and so I wanted to ask you about, when I've listened to your podcast and seeing your deep interest. Writing is writing's like it, and you've written books before. Can I ask you, when did you see yourself as an author, as an artist? Like at a certain point, you're like, shit, this is what I am, and this is my vibe. Because you do a lot of things, so I wanted to ask you about that.
I really appreciate the question. I'll give you the backstory, and I'll keep it brief, because otherwise you'll be thinking, wow, dude, nobody cares that much about your brain. And what I would say is, and I mean this validly, like I'm honored and humbled I get to write at all, much less anyone shows any interest. And it may be the thing I feel most intensely about, but also I feel equally intense about the other things. And it's only one part of the day, and maybe it'll become a bigger part of the day down the road. I would be thrilled. To the beginning of the question, though, and I think it speaks very much to your show and me listening to your other guests. I mean, I love to read. It really has to start there, not because I'm making a dramatic soapbox statement, meaning I never actually thought about writing as a kid. I love when people come on my show or they're on shows like yours and they're like, I knew age
Yeah.
7, I wrote my first novel. So that's not me. I was a wannabe athlete. But I wanted to read. Like as soon as I could figure it out, I was obsessed, and I'm very obsessive. So we shouldn't overstate that. I can get very obsessed about almost anything.
We could tag team on that.
I love that. I need to find my fellow obsessive. It's funny. I'm becoming an old man, which I'm thrilled about. But I used to be a lot more embarrassed about those kind of things. And maybe 5-10 years ago, I just thought, dude, enough being embarrassed about being obsessive, about being a fanboy. It's what you are. Clearly, you're not going to shake it. But I really wanted to read. And so part of you'll see this as it plays out, some of the other stuff you're talking about. I always thought it would be cool to meet writers. I mean, that really is my original thing as a small child. It wasn't, wouldn't it be cool to meet athletes, though it would be, and I'm a bit of a celebrity person. I mean, I'm a bit of a star fucker, apparently. So I've been told. We're allowed to swear, right? I want to be careful. But, I do enjoy a lot of that. But I always thought writers, it would be cool to meet a writer and try to understand all that. So that's the one piece. When I was a senior in high school, I had to take a required creative writing class. And I took it. And a couple of the things I wrote got a lot of attention. And so up until 18 or 19, the idea of being a writer also never occurred to me. And then I thought maybe that's a thing. And then we could break it down. I spent literally 10 to 12 years just thinking about how someone starts. And I can say that because when I turned 30, I woke up, and you might appreciate this, and was through with grad school. I had been married for about a year, and I woke up and I was really unhappy, like unhappy. And I thought, let's break this down. You're happily married, which I was. That's not me saying that in case my wife listens. And you got a cool job, which I did, stuff I wanted to do. And I thought, so something's missing, not to do a branding thing with the book. And I sat there, and this is a true story. I stared at the ceiling and I thought, what's missing? And I thought, oh, you're supposed to be a writer. And within a day or so of my 30th birthday, I started writing. And now I've been going 20 plus years, almost every day. So, I mean, that's the real story, that I had been thinking about it for years, even writing notes down like, hey, if you ever write a book, do this. And then I woke up and I was unhappy, and I thought, okay, man, I didn't have this language back then. How are you going to reinvent yourself? Like, what's going to happen? And I will say, and that's where the podcast and other things come from, it's made my life infinitely better. Infinite. And I feel like it's important sometimes to recognize who I am. I mean, like, I'm really privileged, right? I know that. And I wasn't happy, and that's embarrassing too. So I thought, you're going to have to do something else. And I have stayed happily married. Again, if my wife's listening, I believe that's true. I have these 2 young men in my life, our children, who I love. They're amazing. And without writing, I don't think I'd be a happy person. Like, it's a very odd dynamic. It really was life-changing for me. So that's the sort of short back. I don't know what you're looking for, but that's really the process.
No, I really appreciate that, because look, like my first love in deep study, at the university, when I had that ability to do so, and it was kind of an open field, like, what am I going to do? What am I going to see? It's always books, and it's always been books. So
always books.
and it is. And one of the, and for me, formerly I studied literature in philosophy, but even in philosophy, it's all books, it's all text. And when I started studying philosophy, I became really confused at times, because in my head, it had developed that, like, if you were interested in philosophical questions, you were an absolute, like, literature book hound and all this type of things. And it wasn't structured that way normally. It was more of like, here's your text over here, and there's your fruity type of fiction and all this stuff over here as far as the seriousness. So my mind had developed with, it is those books, and that it is the philosophy. And I think that in talking to artists like you do about their process and such, is that I can't think of anything more complicated, or maybe at times tough to articulate, of their journey of, like, the idea here in what writing does for us. I was listening to the Freakonomics radio podcast.
Yeah, I love those shows.
I just got into, I've listened to Freakonomics before, but I just got into a lot of these different things. But there was just a psychologist, just a simple statement where she said that, when humans were able to take the mess up in their head, or the stuff or the beauty or whatever was up there, and place it out, just place it outside, was such a pivotal development of being like, it doesn't all have to be here in that creative process. So literature is just vital, just vital to me, and that's part of the energy I got from you, and I really enjoyed connecting with your conversations about that process with writers. I wanted to ask, because I want to hit a couple of the big questions to get them in there, and to see your thoughts about it, about art. I see your interest in music. It comes through in your expression of, all the different things you do. I was wondering your thoughts about art and what art is, because it is quite important for both of us, and we talk about it a lot. But what is it? What is it?
Man, I love that. So, first off, if you're going to throw out a big question, right after God, that may be the biggest question. So, right on, what is art? Yeah, it's interesting. And by the way, I love what you're saying about books. I would add a layer to your previous comment, which is that for me too, books were a very tactile experience. Like, I like
Yeah,
holding a book. When I was
yeah,
younger, I always read. I mean, I don't do this much anymore. I'd seem much weirder. Like, I could go into a bookstore and just walk around for an hour and just like run my finger along the spines of books. I didn't even always have to
yep,
take them off the shelf. There was just something about touching one. So it's a real relationship, right? So, right. So what is art? I should add a wrinkle, which might be interesting for us. That I'm the son of an artist, a painter, beautiful. I mean, I know I'm biased and I know he was very, very talented and died way too young. So whether some sort of larger success, which again, I thought he was incredibly successful. I don't think he did. Whether something might have come later, I don't know. But I grew up in a house with an art. This always sounds funny when I say it out loud. My father's an artist. My mom was a therapist. So I was getting it from both sides. Everything's about examining stuff. And my dad, who was also very extroverted, he could lecture anyone on any topic at any time. It's like,
wow,
oh, you want to compare Kafka and the Golem? Oh, you mean the Buddhist this or that? Like, he just do everything. So what is art? It's interesting. It is certainly a manifestation, right? To your point, what's going on in our head. What I think is the tricky part is why we each have certain skills. I can't play a musical instrument, though I'm obsessed with music. I really can't paint, though my father always said, you're better than you think. But of course, he was a good dad in that way. I have a certain kind of it. What's interesting to me and what I have really tried to struggle with, like especially now in middle age, and I think you've touched on this, is not just what is art, but what's an artistic life, right? And so
yeah,
one thing, which again, if you were to go on my website or read my blog, not that these things are necessarily interesting, I'm trying to craft a kind of lifestyle. And I think art is also how we live, right? And I take the living part really seriously. So I think it's a gift. It's a gift when you have a particular skill, right? I don't want to take for granted that as soon as I tried writing, it worked, like something clicked. I also think we limit art too often. Not only do we ignore people that get ignored, right? Somehow quilting is an art or embroidery, but I think we define it too narrowly. I think if my father were alive, we would probably argue about this. And I think my mom and I have argued about it somewhat because I see a lot of things as art, right? The ability to create. I mean, this is a simple answer to a very big question. If you can find a way to create, and I always use this word, and sort of excavate what's in your head and put it out in the world, you've created art. You have created art. And I would say, and you're probably much smarter about this, so feel free to make me sound better. I think we have a universe, a history of people saying what's art and what isn't art. And even though I will push back on anything where someone says this is not something, I also think we define art too narrowly, right? You've got something in your head, you create it, you look at it, and you think, oh, that's what I was trying to say. If you can say what you were trying to say, even if it's a beautiful PowerPoint presentation, I consider that art. It's an
I
expression.
really enjoy that, saying what you want to say. I mean, there's succinct in there. That really struck me, that idea, saying what you
Yeah.
want to say.
And again, to me, what's interesting as someone trying to be an artist, is talking to a fellow artist, is that the saying what you want to say is the hard part. Assuming you have a certain skill or a platform to work on, saying what you want to say is not as easy as you want it. And I would add, and I'm not trying to push the book, but one of the
Push the
threads
book.
of
Push the book.
one of the threads of the missing, and one of the things I'm caught up with as someone who thinks about people, thinks about myself, is that it's very hard to say what you want to say, right? So one of the threads of the book, which is why I also hope people connect with it, whether they've ever been married or care about marriage or care about children, right? Like, and I don't proselytize about marriage or children. I'm glad it's worked out for me. I understand it's not that straightforward, but we communicate poorly, most of us. We don't say what we want to say, or we say it in a way we don't want to say it. Or, and this is my experience, you can literally see the words leaving your mouth and you're like, that's not the way to say it. And it's too late. So one of the subtexts of The Missing, but really all the books I've written, which always sounds obnoxious, is trying to understand how we communicate in different situations, how we try to make sense of that. And that's also the art part, right? Trying to
Yeah.
understand how to say it. Does it sound correct? and doesn't sound correct to others. So here, I want to add a layer. Please respond.
Yeah.
Part of the art is then someone else saying, I like that or I don't like that, right? And either can be fine. So it's also interesting. You have to figure out how to put it out in the world so someone can respond to it. People always say, I would write whether I was getting published or not. I'm sure I would write whether I was getting published or not, but I also very much understand my ego, and I don't want to be writing and not get published, right? Like that's not, yeah. I don't want that. I want to put it out there, right? So some of that's ego, some of that's, what do you think? How did you react to that? And I have to say, anytime someone says to me, dude, that felt like raw nerves as I dove in, I thought, right on, because raw nerves are very interesting to me in the same way punk music is interesting to me, in the same way David Cronenberg movies are. You really feel something visceral. And I love that feeling that maybe on occasion I can create something as visceral as the stuff I love, because I love a lot of stuff, but visceral is always a key factor in it.
Yeah, you got my mind moving, and you mentioned I've told this story a couple times on the show, but you mentioned punk and the sometimes you look at yourself, and like I've looked at myself as far as like contact with art and stuff, and like how does it happen? How do you develop, and how do you take yourself seriously enough to like live an art life? And those developments for me have been much earlier, but I've been able to look back and see what I see as disruptions, because I'm always interested in the disruptions. There's beautiful art that doesn't need to unsettle. I don't need to always be unsettled, but there's something about disruption for me that I'm deeply attracted to. And I talked about a few times, Dr. Cheryl Foster. I took one class. I was studying philosophy, and it was the philosophy of art. And it was just on a whim. I liked art like anybody else did. But in retrospect, it was so clear to me how she was looking to disrupt and looking to make everybody think about art differently. So she started the class, and it was Anarchy in the UK, played the song, and was dancing around to it, right? Like into it and everything. And everybody's like, this is a philosophy art. Did nothing else has happened except, we got the Sex Pistols playing, and I'm like, all right, like what's going on? And when we studied film, I love this to this day. I'll never forget it. You're studying film, and you and I know there are highbrow ways of doing this, right? Like, I mean, there's great film and there's, kind of elite film, and you can look at it that way. But she interrogated us on just using two movies to look at film. And one was, at the time, Silence of the Lambs was hugely influential, popular, best picture, horror movie, shocking movie to this day for most people who encounter it. And talking about that as being recognized. And so we watched that. And on the other side was the study of Saturday Night Fever, which at the time, and this was the piece which was really sunk into my head. So with my age, I knew Saturday Night Fever is kind of you giggle about it. I grew up in the 80s, this disco thing and all this weird stuff. I mean, it was fine, but it was at that time in the culture was this high tragedy, this disco tragedy. And enmeshed in that time, it had a meaning that was much different than the kitschy, kind of goofy, and all those ascensions to height kind of failed over time, because you're like, this is a fucking disco movie. And so those, like when we studied film, it was those two films, and it was so idiosyncratic, so engendering of thinking. And it was my first exposure to thinking about art, and really the one and only art class, which was theory for me, that I've taken. So some of the things you mentioned, punk and in movies, and of course Cronenberg, yes, but that was my introduction to art, and I think I was just propelled from that point to look at it that way, and never inhabited the elite space, I guess what I would say, which really impacts art. There is really an elitism. There is really a difficult way to get the keys to the castle, all those type of things. So I was set up well, and thank you, Dr. Cheryl Foster, to this day for
Yeah,
that.
man. Right on. So let me say, by the way, those are two movies that I consider to be profoundly influential on my brain, if not my actual work. So I think I'm just a little older than you. And so my wife and I have this in common. Our mothers, when we were still too young for it, took us to see Saturday Night Fever. So one of our bonding things is that we were children going to see that movie. What I think is interesting, because you mentioned the kitsch and disco, and this is not to blow myself up, but I'm happy to talk about it. I always took it really seriously, but
Yeah,
I take everything very seriously. So
yeah.
I thought disco was great. I love disco. So I should put
Yeah,
that
I do.
right out.
I do too. I do
I
too.
always thought
We're both okay on that. We're both okay on that.
I always thought it was wonderful. I really, really, that movie had a huge impact on me, Saturday Night Fever, for a lot of reasons, also of which maybe the cheesiest is that, my parents are from New York. Now, my mom will say, well, I really grew up in Baltimore. But in my mind, my parents grew up in New York City. My dad really did. He was a super poor kid from the Bronx and, became an artist, which is an amazing thing after being in gangs and getting arrested and dropping out of high school. And I guess all the things you do back then.
Yeah.
But the reason I share that is that my parents were both fairly highbrow. They're not elitist. They didn't grow up elitist, but they're pretty highbrow. And whether they intended this or not, I take highbrow and lowbrow seriously. Like I really enjoy it. It's all one brow to me. And so sometimes I'll say to my mom, some rom-com we watched that I love. And she's like, really? And I'm like, I'm telling you, that was a great performance. Like last year, the movie Rye Lane came out. I'm giving a huge plug to an indie rom-com from Great Britain that nobody has seen. And it is excellent. But my point, though, and also is that my parents, so again, I'm the son of an artist, but my parents were obsessed with movies. So like you, though earlier and differently, movies really were the lens for me as a kid. Like we're movie obsessive. And so if you ask my mom almost anything, she'll say, wasn't that when we saw that movie? Or that was the time I drove to New York City. Because they raised us in upstate New York. So we did not have access to a ton of culture, though I still got a lot of culture. But we would go to New York City at like the drop of a hat because a show opened up at the Met or there's a new play and we should go see a play this weekend. And we could drive there. And so the reason I'm sharing that is my mom is always like, isn't that when we saw that movie, when we were here? And so it's a lens, in a way, is a lens for my whole life. We use movies as shorthand to where we were, what we were doing, stage of the family. And so you happen to pick two that are very profound to me. One, because of Saturday Night Fever, I went with my mom. And two, Silence of the Lambs may be the first movie I ever went to by myself, which is not a very big deal, except I was living in San Francisco at the time and nobody wanted to go. And I was still pretty young, but I was out of college. And I thought, do I have to go with somebody? And I went by myself, man. And it was a Saturday afternoon. And I just walked to the movie theater from my apartment. And I thought, this is going to be a lifelong thing. You don't need anybody to go with you. Like, I think before that, I just sort of thought you were supposed to. And then I just
Let's pause right there. I encountered that realization as well. And I don't know, it's cultural or something. You go into movies by yourself. But once I broke through like you did, I had not all the, in general, I had a deep preference to see them myself. It was just for me in my brain. And I would do it, with traveling, whatever. The ability to see that a movie time's up a half hour up ahead. I'm done with what I need to do and I'm dropping into the dark right there. And I'm sitting there by myself with my popcorn. I don't need anything more in life. So I learned that like you did early on, just to go for it. But you saw Silence of the Lambs by yourself. What was your how did that movie impact you when you first saw it?
I'm going to actually reference something you said very quickly before. It's that I had never seen anything like it, right? I do think, and I wish I was a little smarter, like it helped rewrite horror at the time. The focus on the female as the protagonist. Also, let's just put it out there, I'm also Jodie Foster obsessive. And I have to say, one of my great pleasures in recent weeks has been A, watching the new True Detective, which is terrific, and B, watching Nyad, which isn't that great. It's okay. But Jodie Foster, and Annette Bening, but Jodie Foster is fantastic. I said this to my mom the other day. I was like, I'm really enjoying Jodie Foster so much this month. Like I missed her. We grew up with her. I mean, I don't know her
She is an
personally, but
amazing. I think
every
maybe,
stage, every stage of my life. My parents were obsessed with Scorsese, and so they were obsessed with Taxi Driver,
yeah,
Jodie Foster.
yeah.
Then Bad News Bears and Silence of the Lambs. Like she is at every phase in our life. So those are important things. How did that affect me? It made me think you can do, I'm going to say this very ineloquently, but you can do whatever you want. If you can figure out how to do it, there's no real rules. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, maybe someone has to give you their blessing, but maybe they don't. Maybe you go make it yourself, right? Like that's what really struck me. I don't think I could fully get it at the time. But that really started a surge of like, dude, go do what you want, go see what you want. It still took me several years to start writing it. So what's also funny is around the time of Sounds of the Lambs, I started journaling about my inability to start writing. And I kept saying, this isn't writing, is it? This is a complaint or an exploration of why it's not happening. So I did that for several years, just writing about how I had to get started. And all of that is around the same time. Like I will say, I'm sure lots of people say this, going to college was not especially profound for me. Moving to California a month after college was absolutely, I don't know, precept shattering. I don't know where that phrase came from. I had like, because being on my own wasn't that big a deal. Working, I always had worked. I'd always taken care of my own laundry. My parents were not, they were both around and not around a lot when I was a kid. So
Sure.
Being on your own was not a thing to me. But being on your own and being like, oh, especially having a job, like you can just go anywhere you want, do whatever you want. If you can pay your own bills, which I could, nobody cares what you're doing. That was mind blowing to me. So Silence of the Lambs becomes part of that. Also, the movie, which I don't know if it's as good as the book, but Naked Lunch, which I think is also Cronenberg.
Oh, yeah.
I've read Cronenberg twice, but I am a bit of a Cronenberg obsessive. I mean, A History of Violence to me and Eastern Promises, those came out back to back. I thought if you could ever write a book and someone reads your book and they feel like they do watching either of those movies, you will have accomplished something. I'll also just have a side note. Did you see A History of Violence, which I think is
I did. I saw it in the theater, actually.
Yeah, me too. So one of the great American movies. But one thing Cronenberg said when he was talking about that movie, which really did have a profound impact on me, is he said, violence is fast. It's not like in the movies. It's really quick and it's messy and it's aggressive. And that's what I was trying to capture in this movie. And when he said that, I paused and I thought, okay, how do you do that on the page? And it really hit me. How do you keep it messy and aggressive and fast? So I always whatever I'm writing, I streamline it as much as possible. I try to have a sense of pace, even if it's just two people arguing over dinner, right? Or hooking up or missing their kid. I want it to feel like, oh my God, this is moving almost too quickly, because real life does move quickly in my version of it, right? So anyway, that's a way longer answer than you're probably looking for, but all of those things are in my head at the same time. And then punk music, where you and I just started. I was not punk as a kid. I was super normcore and boring. And I'm pretty normcore and boring now, and I'm definitely not punk at all. But as soon as I really started listening to it and the stuff I liked, again, all around 30, right? So California is a phase for me.
Yeah.
And then moving to Chicago and beginning to write is a phase. Also, I started thinking, oh yeah, there's a level of aggression that's really exciting. Also, which we haven't talked about, I'm a real pleasure seeker, like to the max. But reading brings me pleasure in the same way other things do. And so then I started listening to punk and I thought, oh, this makes me happy. Like this is happy music. I never understood it. And then it was like anything's possible now.
Yeah, there's a clarity. I think, when we talk about music, both really into music. I enjoy punk. It's like not my favorite genre, like to listen through. There are other genres I like to listen through.
Sure.
The explosive energy and such is and there's an ethos, and there's an ethos in the culture, negative and positive. It's an active, dynamic piece, and sometimes punk like makes you as pissed off as they seem to be pissed off about something, or you completely disagree. But there's this energy of I think it's the disruption, and not all art has to be that way, but just like for me, I think to try to make it succinct is like, if you have a general belief that things are out there are kind of fucked up, then I have an appreciation of the smash it and knock it over to the side. And
Yes. And
I
things
love
are
that
so
energy.
fucked up. Yeah, things are so fucked up. I would also, it's interesting. I'm going to use your word because you said it and it just hit me in a really, I'm going to use my own word, visceral way. But maybe sometimes the disruption's only in your head, right? You're not disrupting society. You're just disrupting the listener. And I'm thrilled when that happens, And again, I would say punk isn't my favorite genre either. I just know that I was trying to understand something about my own brain and how I wanted to live. And I had always hadn't dismissed punk. I hadn't heard things I liked. And I was just in a different place and it hit me differently. And I think I probably also realized that I had a lot more anger than I realized, that I had been sort of like tamping it down, managing it. And, one thing which I appreciate at my age is things are really fucked up and I want to be vocal about them. Right. So I would have never disagreed with a friend up until like 35, 40, if they said something I thought, if something was really poorly said, if it felt racist or misogynist, I always corrected people. But I was careful about other things. And one night I got into an argument with a friend at a bar about something he was so incredibly wrong about. And this is now 20 years ago, but it was so liberating. I thought, okay, let's figure out how not to be a dick, but confront people when they're saying things you just know aren't true. And so I don't want to self-aggrandize because I am not in service to the world in the way I would love to be. But it is very liberating to sort of do your homework and be prepared. And when someone says something that's ridiculous, you can say, look, man, we can disagree, but you're not stating facts. So
Yeah.
let's at least agree. Because, by the way, my kids know this. I never agree to disagree. When someone says, let's agree to disagree, I'm like, no, fuck that.
Let's finish this thing. Let's finish this thing. Let's get to the nub.
Well, let's at least get to the truth. And what I say to people, and I really mean this, is it's more okay with me if you just look me in the eye and say, I don't care what's true, right? Like, fuck you. I much prefer that to you trying to convince me of something we both know is wholly inaccurate. We don't need to argue. Well, I won't give any examples. We don't need to be political, but someone will say something and you're like, I think to myself, we both know that's not true. I know it bothers you in a way it doesn't bother me, but I'm not agreeing with you, period.
Yeah.
We can end it or we can fight. I love to fight, but that's all new to me, by the way. So the punk music helps that a lot.
All right. Hey, listeners, you listen to Ben and Ken connect on a lot of things that excite them. I wanted to talk to you about just like a little bit of wrinkle in something you said about, being a fanboy, that type of energy. I feel like in my show that there's a point I think you have to indulge yourself and indulge your relationship. And I think one of the things that I notice curious reactions to me is getting too excited about things that like were a long time ago, or like
Yes.
I'm a huge I'm a metalhead. I'm a huge Swiftie, like the Swiftie thing, and people, it's that weird, uncomfortable kind of giggly thing around people. I mean, like, you're still going to go on this? You're still going to go on this? So on the fan bit, I'm into comic books and music and movies, like yourself. And
by the way, how didn't we meet sooner? As you walk through the list of all the things I love and stay obsessed with, just want to note that. I'm glad we're meeting now, at least.
Yeah, well, one thing, just before I go on with that, I had a guest, Stephen Pelnat, who I met at the Rose City Comic Con, and he had done these, beautiful comics, zines, and it was called Upstate. And we came in contact with each other, and I saw the Upstate on yours, and those type of things that kind of come up, and I see, I'm like, oh, there's the Upstate here, and there's the Upstate there. But on the fan bit, one thing that I just think in general is that everybody has levels of enthusiasm for things. Yeah, everybody does. I don't know, it's their favorite fruit, or painting, or their cars, or anything. And I think a lot of times folks drop that or get rid of it because it feels eccentric or it feels too indulgent. And one of the pieces, maybe in doing the podcast and otherwise, is just an abandonment on that question. Like, I don't care. Like, I could present myself as not being the person that I am and be more level and all that type of thing. But that's not even me. And I find that a lot of folks, whatever that thrill or enthusiasm stuff, I think a lot of times there's a little bit of a fear to express that, through behavior or emotion. And for me, indulging in that in a healthy way, I mean, everybody can go way too far, but indulging it in a healthy way, exploratory way, is something that I'd never give up. And, working in art and doing a podcast has just taught me, don't, because number one, it's you. And number two is, if people weren't excited or as excited about these things, then I don't know, maybe nobody would pay attention. What do you think about that whole dynamic? I mean, has that been a thing for you, being like, hey, chill out? It's not that great of a song.
It's funny. People have rarely said to me, chill out. And by the way, I too am a Swiftie, in part because my older son is absolutely a Swiftie, and I just enjoy how much excitement he gets out of it. Like, that's something I can totally feed off of. I don't have to love her like he loves her. I love that he loves her, and that's a lot, which makes me enjoy her even more, in that case. But yeah, you actually tapped on the word, I think, is one of the key things about it, is that people, that fear drives a lot of our decision making, right? Another theme of The Missing, again, not to plug the book, but these are things I'm interested in, which is, we make decisions based on fear, not based on who we want to be. We either think society is telling us something. Like, nobody ever told me not to be a fanboy. I believe, though, particularly in high school and college, for me, I wanted to fit in. Like, sometimes people don't want to fit in, but most of us do at some point. And, I had already grown up in a house with an artist dad and a therapist mom, and I didn't have any rules, and I was fairly unsupervised. Like, it was impossible to rebel, but I didn't want to rebel anyway. I wanted to be normal. And so, being normal means tamping down a lot of stuff, right? Society, I don't want to make it all about society in this case, but society certainly tells you, be cooler. Like, don't get so excited. So yeah, I've been abandoning that now for 15, 20 years. But, the 15, 20 years before that, I always struggled with it. Like, just a little embarrassed to get too excited. And I have a lot of things I get excited about. So now I tamp it down for work stuff, and I tamp it down a lot less everywhere else. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if we can abandon those things, it's also very liberating. There's the guy, I always forget his name, so I apologize. He's one of the creators of Freaks and Geeks, and he's the director of Bridesmaids. Oh, I wish I remembered his name. I'm sorry.
I can't either. No.
He's a very interesting dude. So I read an interview with him almost 20 years ago. And it was just, he tapped into what you and I are talking about. He said that his parents always encouraged him to embrace being a fanboy. It wasn't just that they didn't have any judgment about it. They pushed it. And he said, it has served me better to just indulge myself, my obsessions, what I want to create. And I built a whole career as a filmmaker and a writer, and he saw it as all connected. And when he said that, I had already been thinking about it. And that's when I just thought, you know what? I'm giving into it now. We're done fighting that. I was already self-conscious about being self-conscious. And I thought, I'm done. And I don't know if it's made me a better artist or a better person, but it has definitely, to use this theme again, dude, you're really pulling this out of me today. It has made me a happier person, because now it's like, you don't like that? I'm okay. I'll say something about Taylor Swift and I'll get a look. And I'll think, you don't know. I was very excited for Barbie. And my son was very excited for Barbie. And the relationship with movies that I had with my mom, that I have somewhat with my wife, I now very much have with my older son. And we were talking about Barbie for like a year. And people would say, because we're also obsessed with Greta Gerwig and we're obsessed with Margot Robbie. Like, we're obsessed with all the people involved. And the only reason I'm sharing all that is before it came out, I kept talking it up, how excited my son Miles and I were. And people are like, are you serious? And I was like, I don't even care if it's not good. I have been looking forward to it so much. And then we went, and I thought it was wonderful. I enjoyed it so much. But then I was telling people how much I enjoyed it, and I was still getting pushback. And I just kept saying, just go see it. If you don't like it, I would love to have that conversation. But I really haven't. Anyone who went only because I suggested it have been like, oh, you were onto something. I'm like, well, I'm not onto something. It's not
nobody got back to you. Nobody got back to you afterwards. I looked it up. Paul, I'm sorry to interrupt there. Paul, Feig. Paul, is it Fig?
Yeah, it's either Paul Feig or Paul Feig. Right. Thank you.
And by the way, impeccably dressed. Wow, what a wardrobe!
Always, right?
Incredible.
Always in a suit. Always looks stunning.
That's unbelievable. Go ahead.
He's a very interesting interview. And it feels like he must have a really interesting mind. And for any or all reasons, he's almost never created something that I'm not particularly excited about. So we're also
Very
big
cool.
geeks, weirdos in this house. And we actually watch it every summer. My 2 children and I, we watch it start to finish every summer to talk about it. So
Excellent. Love it.
yeah.
All right. We're kicking around art, writing, painting, all these type of things. We got to throw out the other big question, of the show for you to take a stab at, and I'm interested in what you have to say. Is why is there something rather than nothing?
Well, I knew you were going to ask that, so I won't get all excited and say, I'm so glad you asked that. I have been thinking about this quite a bit because I knew I was coming on the show, but in listening to the show, so I do have an idea about this, and tell me if it's the right one. I have a client who I do a lot of consulting work with. He's a scientist. He said something that made me think of you in this show. So I'm going to say it poorly, and then we'll play it out right. He said, when someone says that was meant to be, right? He said, I don't believe things are meant to be. He said, what I believe is that something happens and we need to give it meaning and wrap a story around it. And the way we justify that to ourselves is we say that was meant to be, as opposed to just saying, I'm really glad that happened. And now I'm trying to make sense of it. So when he and I had that exchange, and you and I first talked a couple of months ago, so I've been musing on this for a couple of months. I thought about the title of your show and the meaning, and I thought something rather than nothing. We don't want things to mean nothing. We want things to mean something to us. And at times, they don't necessarily mean anything because it was unplanned or came out of nowhere. And so then we start wrapping a narrative around it. And I thought the something is the story we attach to things, right? That we don't want things that feel important to us to be nothing. I mean, if something's important and it feels like it didn't carry any actual weight, then you've got the sort of paradox or the friction of, well, if this isn't important, why do I care so much? But I thought that's when we make it into something for ourselves. But again, I'm not into destiny or fate, and this guy's a scientist. But when he said that, I thought I'm going to see what they think about that on the podcast. What does Ken think about that? Because I thought that is a big thing. We make things something because we need them to mean something, and that's art too, right? We need something to mean something. We're trying to figure out, to go full call back to the beginning of our conversation. How do we express what we're trying to say? We make it into something.
I think there's something there. A couple comments. I mean, I think there's something there. The core of it is meaning, right? And I think that was particularly important because I think that's what philosophy is really kind of, well, it is all about meaning, right? Whether we should imbue meaning into things or anything, but it is about that there's a value, that there's something about why that we're here. I'll tell you another thing too about these questions. And this might be classical in a certain sense of like the idea of like Socrates with philosophy of, realizing what you don't know. But if you asked me before going into doing these show and asking these particular questions during most episodes, I would expect at a certain time that I'm simply going to be highly articulate about the question and the answers. And for me, it's been an affirmation of like approaches to the question that I don't know. I just don't know. And that's not my guess or anything. Like, I just don't know anything more about the question, but I adore the drops in and from different ways. I had a guest say, what I said, why is there something rather than nothing? And she said, women. That was it. Like if you ask a scientist, and you're going to have that, or if you're going to talk, you could have a direct conversation with a Buddhist who is going to use the terms of something and nothing in a very different way, where the nothingness, the lacking inherent existence, is the fundamental point, and our stuff, the somethings, are about our trying to figure out what that thing is. So for me, it's been all those like ways of going in at the question, and even the question, what is art? I see them so much more similar, or they end up being more similar about the what is art. And what I'm going to say is, like, I don't want to give a sense that like when you're going to ask me the question, you're always going to get a different answer. But I see so much in passing of like how you're feeling at the time. And when you say what is art, you might have just seen, I just saw the movie The Zone of Interest.
Oh.
And it, if I got out of the theater and I saw that movie, and I think it's a profound movie, and for me, the sound design in particular with that, if you asked me that, what is art question after that, I might have just a whole different conversation about, what is art, and also reflecting, maybe if you have to went to a museum. So not that there aren't answers, but I seeing them as like approaches towards in kind of where somebody is at that point. And I don't think that's a comfortable thing for philosophy, because what philosophy, quote unquote, supposed to be is, what's the fucking answer? Ben, what is the answer? And I think that's a big part of it. And I see it with the something rather than nothing, because I don't want to frame it perfectly for everybody, and I don't want to push it towards, because I just don't know, brother.
No, we don't know, right? It's funny, because I'm someone who likes answers. One of my other kind of obsessions, I'm giving you all of them today, is trying to understand how things work. Always been a thing for me. Like, how does that work? How do you break it down? And again, I'm not that scientific, and I couldn't like break down an engine, though I would love to know how an car engine works. But to your point, and you're not saying this exactly, but I'd love to see your reaction. One of the things we all need to do is be able to sit with not knowing, right? That we can't know everything, and that's okay, right? Like detaching ourselves from it. That's one thing. But your other point, which I really, really loved, was you're not the same person every time you answer the same question. It's not just that you don't have the same guest every time. We're not the same people. This same scientist I work with always reminds people that, and this is an old line, maybe it's by Rumi. This is where I get really sketchy. But, you don't step in the same water twice, right? You don't step in the same river twice, because the river's not the same and you're not the same. So I've been thinking about that a lot lately, because in that framework, then you're bound to keep changing and failing and falling short, and being perfect is impossible, right? Like, you're just not the same person you were 5 minutes ago, and you'll be different in 5 minutes. Like, now I've met you. I'm not going to be the same person I was when I came here today.
Right.
Now, I find that very, very exciting. And now something's going to happen tomorrow or next Monday or a year from now. I'm going to think, God, Ken would fucking love that.
Yeah.
Like, you become part of the cells in how I'm going to see the world. So now I'm not the same at all. I'll be thinking about that. And next time Silence of the Lambs comes on, my association won't just be that I saw that by myself some Saturday afternoon, but that you and I talked about it. So that excites me too, right? It also just shows we can keep expand. Like, our universes aren't limited whatsoever. And we're going to fall short, and we're going to fail, and shit's not going to make sense. And. Okay. Right.
Well, I think there's something that's particular within art, and I appreciate everything you said. I think there's something within art, in delving into it and enjoying it and not holding back. And the ideas of, for me, my day job is I'm a union organizer. And
no kidding.
I'm a union representative.
Dude, mazel. So my great-grandfather on my mom's side was a union organizer, turn of the last century in New York City. So props. I hold that in high respect.
That's our next episode. We'll obviously have a couple more episodes that will do. But within that, there's my brain has become wired towards the better, towards connecting people, towards that person knows this and that person knows that. And one of the fun things about the show is that a union brother of mine, Peter Bauer, edits and produces it. And we've worked together for this in entire time. And at some point during the project, we said, holy shit, all we're doing is organizing all the time, right? We're like, if you put an active piece into it, and, why is it that I'll see something at the thrift store and think about a guest from before. Oh my God, they love that. It's an organizing and it's a connecting of people. And I think once I put myself into that, you talked about the art life and thinking about that type of thing, is to live artistically, not and to indulge yourself within that, and to say this person knows that and that person knows that and this person can do this. And that's the way your brain is organizing the whole thing. And if there's electricity, I think, in that for people, and everybody doesn't have to play ball. You and I know that. And it's not like everybody has to be, some guests you would get on, they'd be like, I did the interview for you. That's all cool. But, they have their own thing. But sometimes there's a lot that you can organize and present. So to inhabit that space, there's tons of energy. One final example is I'm doing union work now. I did it in the mid part of Oregon. I'm going to be doing more work working with community colleges in the southern part of Oregon. So I've gone to a couple campuses and starting this, go to the art gallery now. And now I see a name that's somebody from Southern Oregon. And in 2 consecutive campuses, I run into these Artomat machines, which are old cigarette machines where you put $5 in and you get a piece of art. And I've run into those. And I'm like, the thread in the organizing is just going through. So it presents an opportunity to interact. And I love organizing. I love arts organizing and labor organizing. And I've discovered that delve into it, and not to make it overly complicated. I don't have to read a 25-page paper of the best way to connect to people. If you encounter how the best way is to connect folks. Do you feel about the art, that same kind of thing of person to person and the energy and organizing and art life? Yeah.
Well, first off, I love that you used the word electricity. That just got me excited. So there's that. I think, our brains, for the most part, are built to organize stuff, right? I used to do a ton of communications work, and we actually had to research it. I'm no researcher. And, we talked a lot about framing. And framing is how your brain has a whole set of files, and it's already got information ready for you. And part of the job sometimes in communications is to say, I don't want you to go to that file, right? Like the file you have in your head is not the one I have. So there's that piece. The brain's already doing that. But you touched on something I think is sort of both undervalued and not explored enough, is that there is a certain type of person, a certain type of brain. We all do this to some extent. That sees connections all the time. So whether we need to see them, they're there. And I'm not super spiritual, but I also believe on a higher level that we're all connected in different ways. It's hard to always see it. But what I wanted to get to is the less sexy spiritual part, which is someone like you is not only making the connections in your head, but I'm guessing you want to connect the people. And there's a big part of the art universe, really the whole universe, but definitely the one we live in, which is, how can I connect this person and that person, right? Because if they can connect, who knows what they'll create. Sometimes it's just if they connect, then I'm doing everyone a favor because they're going to be magic together. But that to me is that electricity part. It's not just that we find ourselves charged by touching something. It's that then maybe we get 2 other people to connect. And you're like, oh, look at this now. This is so much bigger than I realized. I think the other thing that's cool is discovering that those connections were already there, right? So there's an artist named Alfred Kazin. He's a writer. He's been dead for a long time. He was a Jewish guy last century also. I'd never heard of him when I was younger. So I'm reading an interview with him, and he's got a book called A Walker in the City, which is one of his famous books. So I say to my dad, my Jewish New York dad, have you ever heard of Alfred Kazin? And he rolls his eyes at me like, did I raise you properly? And then I say, do you know the book A Walker in the City? And he literally pulls it off of the shelf we're standing next to. I've never seen it there. He goes, do I know it? Here, I'm bequeathing you my original copy of it. So then I start to read it. And as I read it, it reminds me of my grandfather, another poor Jew from New York, but even farther back. And so I call my grandfather and I say, I'm going to have to presume you know Alfred Kazin, but I'm going to ask anyway. And he said, Alfred Kazin, we used to go on double dates together. And I thought, this really awesome, amazing writer who's somewhat obscure but beloved, every member of my family has some kind of connection to him. And I thought, that's how the world works. That's pretty exciting to me. And that's a whole kind of electricity too.
That's exciting. And in Kazin, I don't know what's happened recently, but big name. I'm familiar with Kazin.
And I didn't realize that, right? That's the other thing you and I have been touching on, being fanboys or into energy. Like, you read about someone who everybody else already knows. Like, they're like, you didn't discover anything, bro. Like, you're just catching up with us. So I've also tried to embrace that. Okay, time to catch up. That excites me. I didn't realize I was so far behind.
I tell you, one thing I wanted to mention for just kind of letting you drop some ways for listeners to come in contact with you. Asking the big questions, really fun. But on a recent episode with Philip Barish that I had, away from trying to explain, ask something rather than nothing and try to explain away, which is fun and awesome. Something happened where he was talking about his departed wife, and she had asked him to create a testament that she was trying to express to him as she was dying about what he called the covenant of their marriage, but to express the stages. So put it within the Christian stages of the cross, her journey. And so, talking about these just incredible, important, and moving things. And then, as we discussed the most profound questions, it comes up at this time talking about this kind of the number 3, which is important with Christian thinking and the Trinity. And at the time it was doing, the time on the counter for the podcast was 33:33. And you'll like this part. For some reason, I was wearing a Larry Bird Celtics jersey with the number 33 at the same time. And I'd be like, yo, I can talk about this question for a little while, but how come there's 3s all popping up when he said 3 on there? And I'm like, okay, I'll back off. I don't know, but that's good enough for me.
Right on, right? We don't understand everything, but there it is. And Larry Bird, God bless.
And Larry, and then Larry Bird. Ben, it's obvious we'll do a couple more episodes in the future and
love
dig
that.
in.
And you're going to come on my show, right? So that I can break you down with all my big questions.
Yeah, I'll be over, and I'm very, very, very honored to make it to your show. But Ben, tell the listeners, right now, there's different ways to kind of interact with the things that you've done, but really kind of lay it out for folks, so where to find you. Talk about the podcast, different ways how do you like folks are interested in what we've been talking about in your work, in the book. Let folks know what to do.
Yeah, right on, man. Thank you so much for that. I'm always, whenever I have a guest, I'm like, and now I'm going to make sure you promote your stuff. So, right, Don't want to be pure about that. Want all the hype. So thank you. I have a mothership, tanzerben.com. I mean, everything you would want to know about me, which sounds like a very nightmarish loaded thing. You can get to at the website, tanzerben.com. I'm very active though. I'm not going to call it X. Still active on Twitter and on Instagram. I enjoy those spaces a lot. Even though they feel more confusing than they used to. Recently jumped onto TikTok. So you can find me in all the places artistic people are trying to make sense of. I'm definitely a sort of all platform approach because people have their own thing. So you find me how you find me. The new book, The Missing, is coming out from 713 Books. Definitely want to give a big shout out to those folks and Leland Chuck, the founder and publisher and editor of my particular book. He's an awesome guy. They do great books. And I want to make a plug. It probably sounds very self-serving, but of course I want everyone to buy my book. But if you love books, please just go buy independent books, right? I mean, this is just a plug for independent anything. I'll be okay if you buy someone else's book. And if it's someone I like, all the better. But 713 Books is great. We will be pre-order soon. It's funny with publishers, this has changed so much. Like bookshop.org is a great place to go to. I'm not live there yet, but we will be soon. And then we'll be on Amazon if that's your jam. No judgment here. Better to sell books than not sell books. So yeah, please check that out. And then the podcast, and thank you for asking, this podcast will change your life, which is sort of my long-running, long-form interview show, primarily with authors, but with any storytellers or ideators or podcasters like yourself. You can always access it at my website, but like you, lucky enough that you can access it anywhere. If you want to go on Spotify, go on Apple, it's there. Please take a look. And any of this, please give me a shout. Let me know what you think. It's really fun to connect with people around these things. But that's probably enough to throw at people, except to say, if your jam is the business side of my life or your life, I'm active at LinkedIn also. I use it.
Great.
It's been very helpful to me as an artist, but I'm also an artist / coach / workshop guy. Got to pay bills. And so I'm active there as well. You can definitely find me if you want. I'd be thrilled to connect.
Oh, love it, Ben. And on the bit, started with books probably and talking books, 2 blocks from where I am in Albany, Oregon, a good friend of mine, Abe Richmond, Browser's bookstore, and talk about on the show here or there, but, indie used bookstore and an important, how important they are, but an important store. And I got to tell you, like, the store reopened pandemic and Abe came on, and we interact regularly, and it's the type of casual conversations and a way of living that is just so deeply important to me. Because, you go to the bookstore, like you said, and checking out the things, and he has eccentric stuff in the back, and he'll come running out and say, "Hey, Ken, look what somebody brought in," all that type of stuff. And so, folks, you'll be able to find Ben's book at Browser's bookstore as well, because Abe stocks and supports Something Rather Than Nothing podcast guests. And Abe also has a zine section, which I've contributed heavily to. So if your brain kind of vibes with that type of stuff, but just want to give a shout out to Abe as well, and let you know about that. Ben, Browser's bookstores in Albany, great supporter of the show. And I'll do an episode. I'll go in and it will be like, "Hey, how about that Ben episode?" And we're chatting about it. And that's art. That's art. That's the arts organizing, and not to be too much about it, but I don't know. I'm just going to recommend that it's a decent way to go about your day.
Look, one thing you'll learn with me, and I hope we get to stay friends after this, nothing is too much for me. I can't speak for your listeners or my listeners. I want all of it. And I really appreciate that. I'll send him a thank you note. I am borderline obscure most of the time. One of the great things that has served me as an author are the independent bookstores in my life. I've had some great champions. I mean, I'm just going to do a quick shout out if you don't mind. So big yell out to Browsers, but here in Chicago, the bookseller, one of my earliest champions, the owner there, Susie T. We have a wonderful new bookstore, Exile in Bookville, Javier and Kristen, where I'm going to do the launch of this new book. I mean, they're wonderful, wonderful people. Volumes bookstore here, Quimby's, which has a great zine section for you, sir, if you want to get some zines there. But I've been blessed with those things. People have been extremely kind to me. I mean, I hope I returned it, right? But man, partially I have any career at all because those bookstores are like, okay, we don't know who the hell you are, but let's get your books in here. You get in here, let's talk business and make connections. So I've been really lucky with that. Very lucky.
And I can't let you go because you said Quimby's in an obscure fact, and I can't speak to the stock level or whether it's still on the shelf, but the rare Something Rather Than Nothing podcast scene #1 issue was on the shelves at Quimby's, and I walked into Quimby's for the first time maybe 2 or 3 years ago when I was in Chicago, and I'm like, I could not love this store anymore because I was wild. I did not know what was in there, and it's even special enough where I remember finding the obscure books for your obscure interest. And I remember buying the book Kathy Acker in Seattle, which was very particular about Kathy Acker's time and the Riot Girls and the PAC NW Pacific Northwest. And hell yeah on the Quimbies.
Quimby's, I always thought and still believe, Quimby's, for what you're describing, it is Mecca in the Midwest. There are many, many wonderful stores and places for obscure and cool stuff. And let's give a shout out. I'm a longtime friend now and a former guest on my show, Liz Mason, who's been managing the store for years and years. She's a goddess and a doyen of all things zine. I actually take one of my college classes to the store, and we do a zine making workshop as part of my larger storytelling push, and Liz leads it. So I'm in the store all the time. And now next time I go, I'm going to be looking for your zine for sure, because that's great.
You can see if it's still there. And I'm
going to go look. I'm excited about that.
Final point, I actually think, and I could be wrong on this on the timing, is it might have been a couple hours ago, but Quimby's has done or does their Saturday Instagram live. I forget what time it is for you over there too. And I know a lot of times I'll get the alert on my Instagram and I'll be like, I'm just going to sit back and listen to what Quimby's is serving up, which is fresh on the show.
I got that notice right before I came on. My phone said, I think it's still sitting there. Quimby's is going live. I ignored it because I was coming to find you, but yeah, it happens, Frank.
Parallel lives, Chicago. Indeed. And a city I love, and out here in Albany, Oregon. I'll be taking a trip over to Browser's bookstore, but so excited about your book, Ben, and so excited to pop onto your podcast, and wanted to give you just a great thanks, for sharing the energy, sharing the space, and thank you for kind words, and for you, it's really inspiring to talk to you about and to indulge in sharing similar interests. I find sometimes folks will drop off and being like, oh, that's your thing. No, freak out on the art that you like. Go nuts on it.
I really appreciate this. I want to thank you for doing this. I want to thank you for bringing a fantastic podcast in the universe. You have some really interesting guests. I mean, I always think, where would I meet that person? So I've really enjoyed it listening to your show, and I listen while I'm running, by the way. So it's a great pleasure. But I also want to say it is wonderful to connect with someone with similar interests. All of a sudden you're an adult. It's not that you can't do it, but it is more involved. So one of the beauties of being podcasters and authors and artists, and going to go back to your thing about connecting, is like, oh, we have that in common. Right on. Who knew? I just wanted to find you.
Yeah.
I had no idea. So look that's a beautiful thing.
All right. I got to tell you, it's been a great pleasure. Like I said, brother, everybody, Ben Tanzer, check out the Missing, the podcast. And, maybe if drop into the art, go excited about the art like we were talking about. Indulge yourself. If you haven't for a while, do it. At least Ben and I is going to say that your life and your day will be improved. Not to proselytize too much, but I'm a true believer, and I know Ben is. So everybody and Ben, thanks, and I will see you on your show in the near future. And thanks for the invite, brother.
Right on, man. Appreciate you. Thanks so much.
This is Something Rather Than Nothing.
And listeners, to stay connected with us and our guests, visit somethingratherthannothing.com. Join our mailing list for exclusive updates and access to guest-created art. If you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please like, subscribe, leave a review on your podcast platform. People really read that shit. Your support helps us reach more listeners and spread our community across the planet. This is a global show, and we like to give a shout out to our many listeners across the world, including many listeners in Canada, Spain, Germany, UK, Argentina, Brazil, India, Thailand, and so many more places. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Something Rather Than Nothing Podcast for behind-the-scenes content. And the best way to help the show is to tell your friends about us. If you love it, they'll love it too. Tell your friends who love it. We love you. This is Something Rather Than Nothing podcast.